Investments in sport have undoubtedly taken centre stage in this regard, and Bahrain is no outlier here, as evidenced by its regular hosting of Formula One racing events, for example. So it's now my pleasure to introduce James Lynch, founding co-director of Fairsquare. James, could you tell us a bit about the whitewashing tactics used by the Bahraini authorities, how effective you think they've been, and what can be done to counter these efforts? Thank you.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks, Salam, for the opportunity. Yeah, I mean, the commonly used term, which I'm sure lots of people are very aware of, is this term sports washing, which is pretty ill-defined, um, and it can mean a lot of different things depending on what country, what context you're talking about. There are different goals associated with it, but I think for the purposes of this conversation, I think what we're talking about is the use of either hosting sporting events or investing in sporting institutions outside the country or sports sponsorship for to kind of project influence for political means primarily led by, and it must be a state that's involved. So we're talking about political or economic means. I think one of the issues that comes up is that obviously it often sports washing does intersect with sort of more mainstream economic activities, diversification, for example, tourism promotion. So it can be difficult to untangle, well, what here is political and what here is sort of normal economic behavior. You know, expanding the sports sector might make sense. I think I think in this case, what's really interesting is Bahrain was first out the gate in the Gulf to see the potential for sports. So it was 2004 that the Formula One was first held in Bahrain. And that's partly because, of course, Bahrain doesn't have the oil, you know, the oil wealth or the gas wealth that most of its neighbors do. So it needed to start diversifying at an earlier stage. And obviously, Formula One is a really good way to promote yourself and make yourself a tourist destination, a business destination. These are big glitzy events. As the repression in Bahrain has deepened over that 20-year period, you know, and obviously we're talking today about 2011, which is maybe the high point or the low point of that repression. Um, the sports have enabled Bahrain to kind of it's what it does is it reduces the political costs of repression. That's the main, that is for me the core element of sports washing. Um, Now, and I think it's really important to say how important this is to the government. You can see it's still going to be important going forward. If you're looking at what the infrastructure projects the governments are planning, they're planning an international sports city. So this is supposed to be completed in 2025. So this isn't the kind of a legacy thing. This is something that the government sees as a future plan. I just wanted to take a quick look at, you know, talk briefly about how this is sort of played out in Formula One, with horse racing, with football, and then a brief look at darts as well, which I think is quite an interesting thing to look at. Formula One is really where the main action has been. That is the centerpiece of Bahrain's involvement in sport. I think one thing I want to flag here is that I think quite a lot of Bahrain's involvement in sport, there seems to be a very deliberate UK angle, and I think that's not insignificant. You know, the UK, as people will know, is probably, you know, is a key strategic, you know, military and economic and political partner for Bahrain that kind of has Bahrain's back and has done for many years. So it's therefore, and yet the that partnership is quite controversial in the UK because the work of NGOs like Salam and Bird and many others, and Amnesty International and others, to highlight the repression and the abuses in Bahrain. So there is a real need to find ways of kind of making sure that that partnership doesn't become overly controversial and contested within the UK. So I think quite a lot of these sports, Formula One, people will know, had a big, you know, background and history in the UK. A lot of the teams come out of the UK. Formula One, the organization itself, you know, has a kind of background in the UK. So the that's where a lot of people in the UK will know Bahrain through the Grand Prix. And it's a big event. It's 100,000 people who come. And recently, Bahrain just signed on for that Formula One race till 2026. That I think is the longest deal that's ever been done in the history of the sport. It's a highlight the importance of of that for Bahrain. You also have Mumtalakat, the sovereign wealth fund, also has a controlling stake in McLaren. I think that's less, which is one of the teams that is in Formula One. I think it would be important to say that while Bahrain really benefits from the glitz and the glamour and the promotion, the kind of circus that comes every year with Formula One, the access that gives you to these devoted fans, because Formula One does unusually, really, outside football, it's probably one of the most voted sort of supporter bases. It's people are very committed to their Formula One team. But despite those opportunities, this has not been uncontested. What we always see with these big events is that on one hand they do help to reduce the political consequences, but they also open up a space for campaigners and advocates to highlight to highlight abuses, and we've seen that repeatedly with Formula One. And I think there's been a lot of pushback. You've even had Lewis Hamilton expressing his concerns, and this is quite an unusual thing to get any athlete, a current athlete of that significance, to actually speak out on human rights abuses is extremely unusual. And that's of course I think that the campaigners who've worked on that need a lot of credit for their efforts. There's also been the Formula One is facing a complaint at the OECD, the national contact point, because of the fact of its failure to address human rights issues directly linked to the races. There's been a number of cases where Bahrainis have protested against the event and then been arrested themselves and then faced torture. So I think that for Formula One itself, Formula One only has a human rights policy because of the Bahrain Grand Prix. So these things they can be a double-edged swords for repressive states who want to use big events. And of course, we saw that a lot of people accuse Qatar of having a World Cup to improve its reputation. Depending on where you were on the world, that wasn't really how it looked. Actually, that the tournament in many ways was not good for Qatar's reputation at all. I think I just wanted to quickly turn to the horse racing. I think is really significant because it's a very different form of use of sport. This is where every year the royal family of Bahrain is very involved in the Royal Windsor Horse Show. They host events such as the King's Cup. Prince Nasser has participated, a very well-known figure to people in the human rights community. And it was very common for the king to be pictured with Queen Elizabeth before her death. So what you're getting there is these high-level personalized connections. I think that's something that often gets forgotten. I think people, when, for example, we talk about, the ownership by the UAE of Manchester City Football Club, I think people often forget about the opportunities that presents for Mohammed bin Zayed to sit next to Erdogan at the Champions League final and to do business, and to forge connections onto the world and use those as symbolism as well. I think we shouldn't forget the importance of the royal box or the VIP box in these stadiums. These are very important. So briefly on football, Bahrain has had a slightly more spotty relationship with football. It has not worked as well, is broadly speaking. People will remember that there was an attempt to actually get Sheikh Salman to be the president of FIFA. That didn't happen, and part of the reason that didn't happen, he lost to Infantino, was because of the massive focus on his role in 2011, and his role in the abuse of athletes at that time. Now it's worth saying, of course, he is still the head of the Asian Football Confederation, and he's just helped make sure that the 2034 World Cup is going to Saudi Arabia. So he's still very much in the picture. Beyond that, of course, people will remember the shocking case of Hakeem Al Arabi, the Bahraini footballer who Bahrain tried to extradite from Thailand. He was living as a refugee in Australia, and it was and again, this was where it really didn't work for Bahrain. This was a case where they were trying to tell the world, this guy is a criminal, but in fact, his alibi was that at the time of the supposed crime that he committed, he was playing a football match live on TV. So again, so Bahrain has had this not a great relationship in some ways with football. And in terms of, it's also had within the UK a couple of quite, a disastrous experience with Wigan Athletic football club, where it hasn't worked out at all. So again, it's not something that always works perfectly, I think is what I would say. I just wanted to touch on darts because I think because people will probably know that there was, or some people may know that there was a really major tournament held in Bahrain very recently, for the second year in a row. And darts is interesting because it's very, very big in the UK. It appeals to almost a completely different demographic from, for example, horse racing. It's a really popular sport. And I think what we see here, it's a little bit like the way that Saudi Arabia is going after football and golf for different demographics. You're going for different, with Bahrain going for darts. I mean, what you are really tapping into there is a deeper, not particularly a politicized part of or a part of the British population that's heavily invested in foreign policy. So this is about kind of broadening out the awareness of Bahrain and building that legitimacy. So I think what I wanted to just finish with was your question, Alex, was has this worked? That's an absolute kind of rapid run through. I think it is a mixed picture. On the one hand, these events can be a lightning rod for citizens and advocates to, they provide an opening, and it brings Formula One and organizations like it, international organizations, into the scope of human rights workers, activities. It creates new kinds of advocacy targets that don't exist otherwise. So on that, you could argue that it hasn't been that successful. I think there is a bigger picture, though, is that I think most people who follow these sports will not necessarily be aware of these discussions. Even Formula One fans may not be aware really about Lewis Hamilton's comments unless these things are getting covered. Unless these things are getting covered by the sports media. I mean, and I think that's what was interesting in 2011 and 2012. The actual Formula One journalists were covering discussions about whether the event should be held in Bahrain or not. More recently, I think these things are often covered more from a foreign policy angle. So it's about trying to get into the sport coverage. So I do think they have had some success in reducing those political costs of repression. I think in terms of what needs doing, I think it's about holding to account these organizations that are making money through these links to Bahrain and not doing their own due diligence, not holding their Bahraini partners to account. The Professional Darts Corporation, what can we do to kind of put them under pressure for next year's event? Thanks. I'll stop there.